The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping the bridge railing. It was June 4th, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had never felt more invincible. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Empire's military machine had rolled across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, swallowing island after island, port after port, dream after dream of their enemies. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the first wave of bombers over Pearl Harbor, approached the admiral with confident strides. His flight suit bore the marks of countless victories, each mission bringing the Empire closer to total dominance over the Pacific theater. "Admiral," he said with a respectful bow, "the strike force is prepared. Midway Atoll will fall before the day is through." Nagumo nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the horizon where 4 of Japan's most formidable aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the choppy waters in perfect formation. These floating fortresses represented the pinnacle of naval aviation, each one capable of launching devastating airstrikes that had already proven their worth from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. The admiral had every reason to believe that this day would be no different from the string of victories that had preceded it. Behind them, the battleships and cruisers of the combined fleet followed like loyal sentinels, their massive guns ready to deliver the killing blow once the airstrikes had softened American defenses. Vice Admiral William Halsey's absence from the American Pacific Fleet had been confirmed by intelligence reports, replaced by the less experienced Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. The Japanese High Command viewed this as yet another gift from the gods of war. According to declassified documents from the U.S. Naval War College, Japanese confidence was at its peak during this period, with many officers believing American naval power had been permanently crippled. What Nagumo could not see, hidden beyond the curved edge of the earth, were the 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lying in wait like predators sensing wounded prey. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval code, and Admiral Chester, Nimitz had positioned his forces with the precision of a chess master setting a trap. Every movement of the Japanese fleet had been anticipated, every tactical decision predicted and countered before it was even made. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles as he prepared his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber on the deck of the Enterprise. Unlike the confident Japanese pilots who had known nothing but victory, McCluskey and his fellow aviators understood they were facing a moment that would determine not just the outcome of a single battle, but the entire trajectory of the war in the Pacific. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on every man preparing for takeoff. As the Japanese strike force approached Midway Atoll, their pilots could see the small garrison island growing larger through their cockpit windows. Anti-aircraft. Fire began to bloom like deadly flowers in the sky around them, but it seemed manageable, just another obstacle to overcome on their path to inevitable victory. None of them realized that hundreds of miles behind them, American dive bombers were already climbing into the sky, their bomb bays loaded with the instruments of Japan's destruction. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific War. At precisely 600 hours on June 4, 1942, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from their carrier decks like a swarm of deadly hornets. 108 planes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and set course for Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation, his mind focused on the mission parameters that had been drilled into every pilot during the long voyage across the Pacific. The Japanese plan was elegant in its simplicity: devastate the American airfield on Midway with a massive airstrike, then follow up with a second wave to finish any remaining defenses before the invasion force moved in. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had conceived this operation as the decisive blow that would force the United States to seek a negotiated peace. Every detail had been calculated, every contingency planned for, except the one that mattered most. 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Spruance paced the bridge of the Enterprise, his normally calm demeanor betrayed by the slight tension in his jaw. The intelligence windfall from the broken Japanese codes had given the Americans an unprecedented advantage, but Spruance knew that foreknowledge meant nothing without perfect execution. His task force commander, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, had positioned the three carriers in what they hoped was the optimal position to strike the Japanese fleet while it was vulnerable. "Launch when ready, Admiral," Fletcher's voice crackled over the radio from the Yorktown. The gamble was about to begin. The American pilots climbing into their cockpits that morning represented a new breed of naval aviator. Unlike their opponents, who had been hardened by months of easy victories, these men had trained with desperate intensity, knowing that defeat might mean the loss of the entire Pacific coast. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8 checked his instruments one final time, aware that his slow, vulnerable TBD devastators would likely face the full fury of Japanese fighter cover. Historical records from the Smithsonian Institution indicate that American torpedo squadrons suffered catastrophic losses during this phase of the battle, with Squadron 8 losing all but one of its 15 aircraft. As the first Japanese bombs began falling on Midway's airfield, the Marine defenders fought back with everything they had. Major Lofton Henderson's dive bomber squadron had already taken off to attack the Japanese carriers, though most of his pilots were flying their aircraft for only the second or third time in combat conditions. The Marines on the ground manning. Anti-aircraft guns knew they were buying time with their lives, each minute of resistance potentially allowing American carrier forces to close the distance for their own attack. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, receiving reports. From the returning strike aircraft, Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio message was troubling. "There is need for a second attack on Midway. The American airfield was damaged but still operational, and enemy aircraft were still taking off to harass the Japanese fleet." This was not the complete destruction that had been anticipated. The Admiral faced a crucial decision that would echo through history. His second wave of aircraft was already armed and ready on the hangar decks, but they carried armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, meant for attacking enemy ships. If he was to launch another strike against Midway's land-based targets, those weapons would need to be replaced with high-explosive bombs, a process that would take precious time and leave his ships vulnerable. At 0730 hours, Nagumo made his fateful choice. "Begin rearming operations immediately," he ordered. "All aircraft are to be prepared for a second strike against land targets." The sound of elevators carrying aircraft down to the hangar decks filled the air as ordnance crews began the dangerous work of switching weapons loads while enemy aircraft circled overhead like vultures sensing carrion. None of them knew that American dive bombers were already winging their way across the empty ocean, guided by broken radio transmissions and the smoke trails of earlier attacks. The trap was closing, and the Emperor's finest naval aviators were about to learn the price of overconfidence. At 0920 hours, the lookouts aboard the Japanese carriers began shouting reports of incoming aircraft, Admiral Nagumo's worst. Fears were materializing before his eyes as American torpedo bombers approached from multiple directions, their obsolete TBD devastators skimming just above the wavetops in what appeared to be a coordinated attack. The Admiral's Chief of Staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, immediately ordered all available fighters to intercept the threats. The next 30 minutes would become known as the Flight to Nowhere for the American torpedo squadrons. Lieutenant Commander, Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet approached the Japanese fleet with grim determination, knowing their slow aircraft were flying into what amounted to a death trap. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters fell upon them like birds of prey, their 20mm cannons and machine guns tearing the American aircraft apart with ruthless efficiency. Of the 15 devastators in Squadron 8, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the Pacific waters and watching the battle unfold around him. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown fared little better, with most of their aircraft shot down before they could even launch their weapons. The few torpedoes that did find their targets proved to be defective, bouncing harmlessly, off Japanese hull plating or failing to detonate entirely. From his position on the Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The American attack had been repulsed with minimal damage to his fleet, and the enemy had revealed the location of their carriers in the process. His staff officers were already plotting courses for a decisive counterstrike that would eliminate the remaining American naval forces in the Central Pacific. But 40 miles away, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey was leading his dive bomber squadron through a gap in the Japanese combat air patrol that had been created by the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. The Zeros that might have intercepted his SBD Dauntlesses were still at sea level, having descended to massacre the torpedo bombers. The sky above the Japanese fleet was virtually undefended. According to the official U.S. Navy battle report, the timing of the dive bomber attack was crucial, arriving just as Japanese fighters were out of position and the enemy carriers were most vulnerable. At precisely 10:26 hours, McCluskey pushed over into his dive, followed by 33 other Dauntless bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown. The Japanese lookouts barely had time to shout warnings before the American aircraft were screaming down through the morning sky at terminal velocity, their 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the wooden flight decks of the enemy carriers. The first bomb struck the Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the aircraft being rearmed in the hangar bay below. The explosion touched off a chain reaction of secondary detonations as fuel and ordnance ignited, turning the pride of the Japanese fleet into a floating inferno. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to the deck by the force of the explosion, struggled to his feet and saw his flagship engulfed in flames. Nearby, the carrier Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate as multiple bomb hits turned her hangar deck into a blast furnace. Captain Jisaku Okada fought desperately to save his ship, but the fires had spread beyond any hope of control. The Soryu, struck by bombs from the Yorktown's dive bombers, was also burning fiercely, her crew abandoning ship as ammunition continued to explode in the lower decks. In the space of 6 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 3 of its 4 fleet carriers. The sight of their burning ships visible on the horizon struck the remaining Japanese crews with a sense of disbelief that bordered on the supernatural. These vessels had seemed invincible, carrying the Emperor's divine protection. Across the Pacific in an unbroken string of victories, Commander Fuchida, wounded by shrapnel on the Akagi's bridge, watched in horror as the accumulated might of Japan's carrier force disappeared in columns of black smoke. The warrior code that had sustained him through countless battles suddenly felt inadequate in the face of such overwhelming disaster. The gods of war, it seemed, had chosen a different champion this day. The power that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific was literally going up in smoke, one burning carrier at a time. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of the burning carrier Soryu, his white naval uniform already singed by the flames consuming his ship. The proud vessel that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and countless victories across the Pacific was now a floating pyre, her flight deck twisted into unrecognizable metal sculptures by the heat of exploding aviation fuel. Yet, Yanagimoto refused all entreaties from his officers to abandon ship, choosing instead to go down with his command in accordance with the ancient code of Bushido. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, launched a desperate counterstrike against the American fleet. The admiral knew that his 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters represented Japan's last hope of salvaging something from the disaster that had befallen the mobile force. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the formation toward the coordinates where American carriers had been spotted, his mind focused on delivering a blow that might yet turn the tide of battle. At 1400 hours, Kobayashi's aircraft found their target, the USS Yorktown, already damaged from earlier Japanese attacks, but still operational. The American carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened up with a withering barrage, filling the sky with deadly shrapnel, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attack with the fatalistic courage of samurai facing inevitable death. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown, causing severe damage and forcing her crew to abandon ship temporarily, but even this small victory proved hollow. Admiral Spruance, commanding from the Enterprise, immediately launched a retaliatory strike against the Hiryu. The American dive bombers found the last Japanese carrier just as her crew was celebrating their successful attack on the Yorktown. At 1700 hours, 4 1,000-pound bombs transformed the Hiryu into yet another funeral pyre on the Pacific Ocean. Naval historians at the U.S. Naval Academy have noted that the loss of all 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day represented the most decisive naval defeat in modern warfare. Admiral Yamaguchi, like Captain Yanagamoto before him, chose to remain aboard his burning ship rather than face the disgrace of returning to Japan with news of such a catastrophic defeat. As the Hiryu settled deeper into the water, her magazines finally detonating in a spectacular fireball, the last of Japan's carrier-based air power disappeared beneath the waves. The empire that had seemed poised to dominate the Pacific had lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers and over 200 of its most experienced naval aviators in a single afternoon. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received the devastating reports. With growing horror, the man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor and warned his government that Japan had perhaps a year to achieve decisive victory, now realized that the window of opportunity had slammed shut forever. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he had reportedly said after Pearl Harbor, and now that giant was beginning to stir with terrible purpose. The Japanese survivors floating in life rafts and clinging to debris watched American ships pass by without stopping to pick them up. This was not cruelty, but necessity. The Americans were still in enemy waters and could not afford to compromise their mission for individual rescues. Commander Fuchida, among the survivors, later reflected that this moment marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific, a withdrawal that would end 3 years later in the atomic fires over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding the Hornet, surveyed the smoke-stained horizon where 4 Japanese carriers had burned throughout the day. His own air groups had suffered heavy casualties, but the strategic victory was complete. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered as thoroughly as the enemy flight decks his bombers had penetrated with their deadly cargo. As night fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the balance of power in the world's largest ocean had shifted permanently. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese expansion for 6 months was setting on an empire that would never again possess the strength to threaten American shores. The bombs that fell on Midway had indeed marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy. The Dragon had breathed its last breath of fire, and the Eagle was ascending. The pre-dawn darkness of June 5, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean littered with the detritus of shattered dreams. Oil slicks spread across the water like black blood, marking the graves of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had carried the Emperor's ambitions to the bottom of the sea. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, aboard the super battleship Yamato, stared at the radio reports with the hollow expression of a man watching his life's work crumble into ash. The architect of Pearl Harbor faced a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his shortened life. His surface fleet still possessed overwhelming firepower. The Yamato alone mounted 18-inch guns that could obliterate any American vessel from beyond the horizon, but without air cover, these magnificent warships had become nothing more than expensive targets. The age of the battleship was ending, killed by the very carrier aviation doctrine that Japan had pioneered and perfected. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American task force after Admiral Fletcher's transfer to the damaged Yorktown, pursued the retreating Japanese fleet with the methodical precision of a surgeon removing a cancer. His pilots, exhausted from the previous day's fighting, nevertheless climbed back into their cockpits with the grim satisfaction of men who knew they were witnessing history. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers and F-4F Wildcat fighters that had seemed so inferior to Japanese equipment just 24 hours earlier now ruled the skies over the Central Pacific. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, damaged in a collision during the chaotic night withdrawal, became symbols of Japan's new vulnerability. Lagging behind the main fleet and unable to defend themselves against air attack, they were set upon by wave after wave of American aircraft. Commander Richard Fleming, piloting a Marine Corps dive bomber, pressed his attack on the Mikuma with such determination that his aircraft was struck by anti-aircraft fire. Yet he continued his dive until both plane and pilot disappeared in the explosion of their own bomb. Military historians from the MacArthur Memorial have documented that the loss of trained naval aviators at Midway proved even more devastating to Japan than the loss of the carriers themselves, as replacement pilots could not match the experience of the veterans who perished. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled through the Japanese fleet like a tsunami in reverse, pulling away the confidence that had sustained the empire through 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Sailors who had considered themselves invincible now scanned the skies with nervous eyes, knowing that American aircraft could appear at any moment to deliver the same fate that had befallen their comrades. The warrior spirit that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific was giving way to the desperate pragmatism of a retreating army. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was finally rescued by an American seaplane after 30 hours floating in enemy waters. His first-hand account of the battle would later provide crucial intelligence about Japanese defensive tactics, but more importantly, his survival became a symbol of American resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The young pilot who had watched his squadron mates die around him now represented the determination that would carry American forces across the Pacific to the very shores of Japan. Emperor Hirohito, receiving news of the disaster in the carefully sanitized language of court protocol, nevertheless understood that something fundamental had changed in the character of the war. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan from foreign invasion had failed to materialize when it was needed most. Instead, it was the Americans who seemed to possess supernatural luck, arriving at precisely the right moment to catch the Imperial fleet at its most vulnerable. The battle's aftermath saw both sides struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. American newspapers, initially cautious about claiming victory, gradually began to understand that their forces had achieved something unprecedented in modern naval warfare. The Japanese, meanwhile, attempted to suppress news of the defeat, telling their citizens that Midway had been a minor setback rather than the catastrophic loss it truly represented. As the surviving Japanese warships limped back toward their bases, many sailors wrote final letters to their families, convinced that they would not survive the long retreat that lay ahead. The empire that had seemed destined to rule the Pacific was now facing the prospect of defending its home islands against an increasingly confident and capable enemy. The tide of war had turned red with Japanese blood, and the current was flowing inexorably toward Tokyo Bay. The sun was setting on the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and darkness was falling over the dreams of empire. 3 weeks after the smoke cleared over Midway Atoll, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his office at Pearl Harbor, studying intelligence reports that painted a picture of Japanese desperation across the Pacific theater. The enemy's attempt to maintain operational security about their losses had failed completely. American codebreakers were intercepting frantic requests for replacement pilots, spare parts for aircraft that no longer existed, and emergency reassignments of naval personnel to shore duties. The Imperial Navy was bleeding expertise it could never replace. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto found himself increasingly isolated within the naval hierarchy as Emperor Hirohito's advisors searched for someone to blame for the Midway disaster. The same strategic genius who had been celebrated for Pearl Harbor now discovered that success had many fathers, while failure was an orphan. His requests for additional resources to rebuild the carrier fleet were met with skeptical questions from Army officials who had never trusted the Navy's grandiose plans for Pacific dominance. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, awarded the Navy Cross for his role in sinking the Akagi, struggled with the weight of fame that accompanied his sudden celebrity status. War correspondents wanted to interview the pilot who had turned the tide of war, but McCluskey found himself haunted by memories of Japanese sailors burning alive on the flight decks below his dive bomber. Victory, he learned, carried its own psychological casualties. The strategic implications of Midway rippled outward like concentric circles from a stone dropped in still water. Australia, which had been preparing for Japanese invasion just weeks earlier, began shifting its military forces from defensive positions to preparations for offensive operations. The Soviet Union, watching Japanese strength evaporate in the Pacific, started moving divisions from its eastern borders to reinforce the desperate struggle against Nazi Germany. The global balance of power was realigning itself around the smoking ruins of 4 aircraft carriers. According to declassified documents from the Roosevelt Presidential Library, American military planners immediately began developing offensive strategies for the Central Pacific following the Midway victory. On Guadalcanal, Japanese engineers continued construction of an airfield that would soon become the target of American invasion forces emboldened by their recent victory. The Henderson Field that would cost thousands of lives on both sides was being built by men who did not yet understand that their nation's ability to defend such forward positions had been gutted in 6 minutes of accurate dive bombing 3,000 miles away. The dominoes were already falling, though few could see the pattern. Commander Fuchida, recovering from his wounds in a Tokyo naval hospital, spent his days writing detailed reports about American diving tactics and aircraft performance characteristics. His observations would help train the next generation of Japanese pilots, but both he and his superiors knew that replacing the experience lost at Midway would take years that Japan did not have. The institutional knowledge that had made Japanese naval aviation superior to all competitors had gone down with the carriers. American shipyards, meanwhile, began accelerating production schedules that would eventually launch a carrier every month. The industrial capacity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared at Pearl Harbor was beginning to assert itself with mechanical precision. Each new USS Essex-class carrier represented not just steel and aluminum, but the accumulated frustration of a nation that had been caught sleeping on December 7, 1941. The Japanese home islands themselves began experiencing their first taste of vulnerability when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's bombers appeared over Tokyo just weeks before Midway. Though the actual damage was minimal, the psychological impact was enormous. If American aircraft could reach the Emperor's palace, then nowhere in the empire was truly safe. The divine protection that had supposedly surrounded Japan for over 1,000 years was proving to be as fragile as rice paper in a typhoon. In the Solomon Islands, Marine Corps planners were already studying maps of beaches that would soon be soaked with American blood. Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal, was conceived as a limited offensive to prevent Japanese aircraft from threatening the supply lines to Australia. None of the planners realized they were designing the first step in a 3-year march across the Pacific that would end in Tokyo Bay. The battle that had begun with such confidence on the Japanese side was transforming into a nightmare of retreat and desperate defense. Each day brought new evidence that Midway had not been an anomaly, but rather a preview of American capabilities that would only improve with time and experience. The empire was learning the bitter lesson that strategic momentum, once lost, is almost impossible to recover in modern warfare. By December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the full magnitude of Japan's strategic catastrophe at Midway had become undeniable even to the most optimistic members of the Imperial General Staff. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal and were locked in a grinding campaign that was consuming Japanese aircraft and pilots at an unsustainable rate. Every replacement pilot shot down over Henderson Field was a veteran who had learned his trade in the skies over China or the Dutch East Indies. Experience that could never be replaced by the hastily trained teenagers now filling Japanese cockpits. Admiral Yamamoto. His health deteriorating under the stress of managing an increasingly hopeless strategic situation, made one final attempt to regain the initiative by planning a massive surface engagement near the Solomon Islands. The operation, designated IGO, would commit Japan's remaining carriers and battleships to a decisive battle that might restore the balance of power in the Pacific. But the intelligence networks that had served Japan so well in the early months of war had been systematically compromised, and American forces were reading Japanese communications almost as quickly as they were transmitted. On April 18, 1943, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Admiral Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville Island, ending the life of Japan's most capable naval strategist in the same manner that Japanese fighters had killed so many Allied pilots during the dark days of early 1942. The architect of Pearl Harbor died knowing that his greatest victory had ultimately doomed his nation to defeat by awakening American industrial and military capabilities that Japan could never match. The replacement pilots now flying from Japanese carriers were receiving less than half the training time of their predecessors, with predictable results when they encountered seasoned American aviators in the latest Grumman Hellcats and Vought Corsairs. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944 would see over 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day, effectively ending Japan's ability to conduct carrier operations for the remainder of the war. Naval records from the Imperial War Museum indicate that Japan never recovered from the loss of experienced pilots at Midway and subsequent battles, leading to a death spiral in aircrew quality that continued until surrender. Emperor Hirohito, reviewing casualty, reports in the bomb-proof shelter beneath his palace, finally understood the true cost of the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. The same advisors who had promised swift victory were now suggesting that Japan could negotiate an honorable peace by making the cost of invasion prohibitively high. But the Americans who had turned the tide at Midway were not interested in negotiation. They were methodically destroying every aspect of Japanese military power with the industrial efficiency that Yamamoto had warned about in 1941. The strategic bombers that began appearing over Japanese cities in 1944 were the direct descendants of the dive bombers that had sunk the carrier fleet at Midway. The same targeting precision that had placed 1,000-pound bombs through flight decks was now being applied to aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks throughout the home islands. Japan was learning that wars of aggression carry the risk of bringing total war to one's own population. By August 1945, the empire that had seemed poised to dominate East Asia was reduced to contemplating suicide attacks by schoolchildren armed with bamboo spears. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki merely provided Emperor Hirohito with a face-saving excuse to surrender, rather than admit that Japan had been systematically defeated by conventional forces that traced their origin to the tactical innovations pioneered at Midway. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, featured many of the same officers who had participated in the Midway operation 3 years earlier. General Douglas MacArthur, accepting Japan's capitulation, spoke of building a new world order based on democratic principles rather than military conquest. The empire that had sought to reshape Asia through force of arms was now learning the harder lesson of reconstruction through cooperation. The bombs that fell on Midway Atoll had indeed marked the beginning of the end for Japanese power in the Pacific. 6 minutes of accurate dive bombing had destroyed not just 4 aircraft carriers, but the entire strategic foundation of Japan's war effort. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese expansion across the Pacific had set forever on June 4, 1942, though it would take 3 more years for the empire to acknowledge the darkness that followed. In the end, Japanese power was not lost through a single dramatic defeat, but through the accumulated weight of countless tactical mistakes that traced their origin to those fatal minutes when American dive bombers found their targets undefended. The thunder of exploding bombs had echoed across 3 years of war, finally falling silent only when Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radio waves, admitting that the war situation has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. The moment Midway's bombs were dropped, the Pacific War was over. Everything that followed was merely the long, bloody process of making that reality undeniable to both sides.